Hey everybody, welcome to episode 0 of the Andrew Deitsch Podcast. I've been working extremely hard to get this project off the ground, and so I really appreciate the time to checking this podcast out. I really appreciate you checking this out. So to kind of just give a little overview, it seems like everybody is creating small bite-sized media these days. And no doubt social media has played the biggest role in this shift. Content is getting shorter and shorter. And if you really think about it, when is the last time that you were able to sit down with a friend and have a meaningful conversation? My philosophy is that the best conversations always happen distraction-free and face-to-face. And my podcast is about having uninterrupted conversations with fascinating human beings. So since you've never listened to my podcast before, I wanted to kick things off with a little introduction and tell you about my mission and my vision for the podcast and tell you a little bit more about the guests that I've had so far. But to give a little introduction to myself, in case you're not familiar with me, maybe you were brought here by one of my guests and you're interested in listening to their podcast. But my name's Andrew Deitsch. I'm almost 23 years old. I'm turning 23 in just a couple days. And I really hate to put myself into a box, and I try not to be the bragging type, but I'll try to shed some light on who I am and what I do. So just to name a few things, I'm a creator, I'm a world traveler, I'm an entrepreneur, a student of the world, I guess you could say. I'm a college dropout. I'm a fitness and health fanatic, and now I'm a podcaster, so I can add that to the list now. So just to elaborate a little bit, I've lived in foreign countries for 10% of my adult life. I've explored 3 continents, and in the past year, I've taken 24 flights, 17 of which were international. I'm very passionate about entrepreneurship. I don't currently own a business right now, but this podcast hopefully can take off and become some sort of revenue source for me. And I dropped out of college after 1 year to pursue an opportunity to grow my own business as an affiliate marketer for an international health and wellness company. And my organization actually reached the top 5% of the entire company, so I was pretty proud of that. All the artwork you see for the podcast has also been created by myself, unless otherwise explicitly stated. Some of the artwork, like for example, Elizabeth Ward's podcast that I did, a few of the pieces of that artwork were actually from herself or photos from other photographers of her. But other than that, I was able to compose and make all of the artwork for the podcast. I love making visual art on Photoshop. Also, I love creating content on Snapchat. Some would say I'm an ultra Z-list celebrity on there. I do have a few thousand followers from all over the world who watch my stories, especially my travel Snapchats. When I'm traveling, I love making Snapchat stories. But that's pretty much just a quick snapshot, I should say, of who I am and some of the things I've done. And I'm sure over the course of these podcasts, you're going to learn a lot more about me. But yeah, so over the past few years, I've become kind of a podcast addict when I'm driving, cooking, working out, and pretty much anytime my hands are busy, but my mind is not occupied by anything, I love listening to podcasts. And conversational podcasts are my absolute favorite. There's something special about listening to fascinating people, exploring topics and sharing their opinions and life stories. I'm a firm believer that you can learn something from everyone, and I can safely say that podcasts have changed the way that I view the world, and I learn something new every single day through listening to podcasts. Obviously, it depends on what podcasts you like, but I listen to podcasts pretty much every day. And I'd messed around with the idea of starting my own podcast for a while, but I finally decided to get serious about podcasting about 2 months ago when my buddy Graham invited me to be a guest on his podcast. And once we finished recording, I knew that I owed it to myself to start my own. So here we are. But my vision for the podcast is to have meaningful, long-form conversations with fascinating people. And I want to create content that I would want to listen to. There isn't really a hardcore focus as far as subject matter. Every podcast will be different, but some major themes include health, fitness, entrepreneurship, and traveling. And my guests are people who I love talking to and who have a different, or maybe they have an interesting perspective, or maybe I really enjoy their story and I want to share that with you guys. And it's pretty rare to be able to actually really sit down with someone and have a long conversation without being interrupted by our phones or having somewhere to be. And the places where I've found that I'm able to do this are on, like rooftops and hammocks, sitting around a campfire. And I want to create environments like that in my podcast where you can just have deep, awesome conversations. But my vision for the future of this podcast is to be able to create a revenue stream from advertisers that I believe in and listeners that want to financially contribute. This would allow me to focus completely on creating content for the podcast as well as videos and stuff like that. And it would allow me to pursue my passions of traveling the world. The way I see it is I'm young and I want to travel and see more of the world. And so what better way to do that than go and visiting my friends that I've made and making new friends. And I want to be able to visit my friends from all over the planet, and I want to be able to visit them so we can have face-to-face podcasts and share stories and experiences and share them with you guys. So as of this recording, I have 8 episodes in the tank. Once this podcast is posted, I'll be posting the 8 podcasts that I have. And so I'll kind of give you a brief overview of those so you can get a general idea of which ones you might want to listen to. Hopefully you'll want to listen to all of them because they're all really good, but if you want to pick and choose, that's cool too. So the first podcast is with my good friend Adam Kashoro, better known as Meal Prep Poppy. He's a certified personal trainer, a public speaker, and he's the founder and CEO of Atlanta's premier meal prepping service, Meal Prep Poppy. Besides being a total beast in the gym, he's totally jacked, but he is also a beast in the kitchen as well, and that's what kind of inspired him to move into this culinary space. But in our podcast, we had a great time talking about being the child of Tanzanian immigrants. We talked about his training styles in the gym, his mental shift into the world of entrepreneurship, our mutual love of electronic dance music and music festivals, and how he was featured in Jezebel magazine. And also, we talked about how traveling the world has really changed his life and his outlook. So definitely, you should check out that podcast. Episode 2 of the podcast is with my beautiful and amazing friend, Ashlynn Showalter. Of many things, Ashlynn is an NASM certified personal trainer, and she's a world traveler. She's also just a fantastic human being. But I've known Ashlynn since we were in high school, and on this episode, we were able to catch up and have an awesome conversation about a whole bunch of topics. But we talked about growing up being homeschooled. We talked about meditation, finding your own happiness, fitness and her training styles, and diet. And we also talked about relationships and stuff like that. So you should definitely check out that podcast. I really enjoyed that one. Episode 3 is with my good buddy Davis Jenkins. And Davis is a real estate agent for Keller Williams, serving the metro Atlanta area. And in this podcast, we honestly didn't talk too much about real estate because I mainly wanted Davis to share his story. And this was the first time Davis had actually spoken out on a public platform like this. So I really appreciated his vulnerability and his honesty. Davis and I have actually known each other for a few years now, and I can honestly say he is one of the nicest and most caring individuals that I've come across. And during our podcast, he shares his life story, overcoming lots of struggles and obstacles, and his perspectives on that. And I don't want to get too much into that just because I really want you to listen to it straight from him. So checking out that podcast is definitely a must. Episode 4 is with my new friend, Tyler Small. I say new friend because I've only known Tyler, excuse me, I've only known Tyler for a couple weeks. And actually from the moment I met Tyler, I knew that he was somebody I wanted to be friends with. And we recorded the podcast only about a week after meeting Tyler. We instantly clicked, and on this podcast, we kind of talked about sneaking backstage together at a music festival that we met at, growing up skateboarding, his career being a model, streetwear fashion, and we talked a good bit about sneakers too. So if any of that sounds cool to you, I would definitely check out that podcast. I had a great time chatting with him. Episode 5 is with my friend Trey Reed. And growing up, Trey was kind of like an older brother to me. I always had awesome conversations with him. And this podcast was no different. Trey lived in Korea for about 2 years. And we actually didn't even have time to get into that very much. We were too busy talking about politics in the beginning. And then we got into his personal story. And his story is amazing. Again, I don't really want to spoil too much just because I want you to hear it straight from the horse's mouth. But his story is fantastic, and you definitely need to hear it. Needless to say, he'll be coming back on the podcast to talk about his travels in Korea. And definitely check that podcast out. Episode 6 is with Parker Stiles. Parker is the owner of Barrington Acquisitions, a company that he runs with his wife, Casey. And they purchase, renovate, and sell or rent out single-family homes and other properties around the Atlanta area, as well as in South Carolina, I believe. And he shares his story of how he went from being an unemployed college graduate to running this super successful business with multiple employees that basically pays him while he sleeps. You know, he's got these rental properties that he makes money on regardless of whether he's working or not. So pretty cool stuff. The podcast was actually extremely informative, and Parker gives a lot of practical information on how he started that company and what it takes to run a successful business. So definitely check that out. Episode 7 is with Dr. Dre, the real Dr. Dre. I'm serious. My friend, Dr. Andrea de la Garza. Did you like that? My friend Andrea de la Garza is a doctor of chiropractics, and she goes by Dre, so we call her Dr. Dre. But though this podcast was a little bit shorter than the other ones, I absolutely had a fantastic time talking to her. Growing up in Mexico and Argentina, Dre has a fascinating perspective on, tons of things, really. But she's one of the ones I do not think that Donald Trump will be kicking out. Hopefully. She's an awesome person. We love our Mexicans here. So Dre got into it. We were talking about how she was an NCAA athlete in gymnastics. She wanted to pursue a career in health, so she decided to become a chiropractor. So now here she is, a licensed doctor. She's a total badass, and she's an amazing athlete. And I loved this conversation that we had. We covered a lot of topics, including growing up in Mexico, coming to America, why chiropractics is so important, stem cell research, and her fitness and training styles. And I actually learned a lot during this podcast, and I cannot wait to have her on again because we really got into it on a lot of fascinating topics. Episode 8 is with the amazingly talented Elizabeth Ward. And of many things, she is a professional dancer, an artist, a world traveler, a model, and an athlete. And Elizabeth and I have actually known each other for the majority of our lives, which is kind of crazy. But I wanted to have her on the podcast because she has a very balanced and interesting perspective on life. And she shared many stories with me, including her dad leaving, her mom and siblings, her views on college and why she is not going back after 3 years, moving to Germany, being a nude body painting model, and being homeless, sleeping in her car, and selling selfies on Instagram. It was definitely a great podcast, and I definitely would love to have Elizabeth on again. We recorded that podcast pretty late, so by the end we were like delirious. But definitely check that podcast out. It's extremely interesting. So hopefully you get to listen to all these amazing conversations, but even if they don't interest you or you don't have time to listen to them all, it would still be extremely helpful if you could download all of those podcasts on iTunes. This helps me climb the rankings of the new and noteworthy section, and I only have 8 weeks to climb those rankings because you can only be new for 8 weeks essentially. And this will really go a long way in helping getting this podcast discovered and getting more people to check it out. So if you want to support the podcast, please rate and review the podcast 5 stars on iTunes and give me some feedback there. And also please download all the episodes and subscribe. But thank you so much for listening, and I hope you enjoy the Andrew Deitsch Podcast. Bye-bye.